Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is day 4 of Oxford Spark's Brain Discovery Week. We've been talking to neuroscientists, psychiatrists, all sorts of people this week. And today, as you can see, we're in a dentist surgery. Maybe something that a lot of you experience pain at. And we have Dr. Andrew Segerdahl today, senior postdoctoral researcher from the Nuffield Department of Clinical Neurosciences, talking us through all things pain. Don't forget that you can ask your questions live. Just put them in the comments box below. So, hello.
Hey, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Yes, thanks for speaking to us all around the world.
Yeah.
So we're talking about pain. Mm-hmm. Perhaps we can start off with what pain is.
Sure, and I should say I'm not a dentist, and my experiences within the dental community have always been good. If you're with a good dentist, usually the pain shouldn't be so bad. But I think it's helpful to think about dental pain because dental pain makes me really nervous, and one thing that pain is that it's a subjective experience. So one of the things I'm interested in is understanding how the brain is involved in that process. So pain comes from brain function, and what the brain is doing and how it's doing it is what we use imaging to try to understand.
Okay, so we might experience pain as we have an injury or whatever.
Yeah.
So
you can have physical pain and you can have emotional pain, and I think everyone has probably experienced both in their lives, and often they can feel really similar. Heartbreak can actually be physically painful, but actually what you find is that when you are imaging the brain, those experiences, while similar, they're not identically similar. So what I mean by that is that the brain regions that are involved and how they're communicating, they're actually different. So one of the really big interests of mine is actually thinking about physical pain. So in the context of like acute pain, so pain that's really short lasting, if you prick yourself with a pin or maybe you stub your toe, we know quite a lot about the physiology and the biology of that kind of experience. It's short acting, it's like a flash in the pan in the brain, but the brain is really good at actually turning the system back down. You carry on with your day and you move on. The problem is when that pain becomes chronic. And so chronic pain is defined as pain that lasts for more than 3 months. And really what's happening in that setting is that the body is struggling essentially to overcome the pain. And so the pain is actually inducing functional changes, which essentially end up perpetuating and maintaining the pain. So that becomes a problem because, and anyone, if you've ever spoken to someone who has chronic pain, often no drugs work, often they don't help, or they only minimally help, and certainly when people have pain over many, many years of their lives, it really is undermining their quality of life. And so a lot of this work is trying to understand how does a healthy person experience pain, and what is healthy brain function like in that setting, so that we can then understand how that becomes dysfunctional in patients, and specific types of chronic pain patients specifically.
Okay, well, loads of stuff to unpick there. But maybe we could just start off with talking about the sort of impact of chronic pain, just to set the scene a bit. So it's relatively common?
It's very common, unfortunately. So, and I'm sure that everyone knows somebody who suffers from chronic pain or has suffered from chronic pain, or maybe themselves suffer from it. So a recent study by the BJ actually found that in the UK alone, up to 50% of the adult population suffers from or has suffered from chronic pain. And what's really sad to know about that statistic is that about 10% of those individuals have the worst kind of chronic pain. So this is extremely severe, intractable kinds of chronic pain. So that's millions of people. And even in the younger population, so this 18 to, I think they capped it at 39 years old, so I'm happy to still be in that category. But they, up to, I think it's close to 20% of those individuals in that age group are suffering from chronic pain. So it's very prevalent, and it's a real problem. And so we have a lot of work to do to try to understand how we can help these people. Because it's very costly, and it's costly not just because it's difficult to treat chronic pain, as I've mentioned, and any chronic pain patient will tell you that it is hard to battle this pain. but also then people aren't going to work, and so that's costly. And it's just the quality of life of an individual that's suffering from chronic pain is minimized, it's diminished. And that's a huge problem. So for me, it's a passion of mine. I really want to understand how we can solve this very complex, but very, very present issue.
So you're doing that by starting to look into the brain and kind of see what happens. Can you tell us a bit about how you actually do that? Like, how do you look at pain in the brain?
That's a great question. So we use a really powerful tool called magnetic resonance imaging. So fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And so if you split that weird term up, the function is meant to, what I mean by that is that we're actually looking at how different parts of the brain, the different structures in the brain, are becoming activated and engaged during a pain experience, and also understanding how those different parts of the brain are communicating with one another, and also how those parts of the brain are communicating with the spinal cord, parts of the brainstem, and the rest of the body. So this tool is great because it's non-invasive, it's completely safe to go into the scanner. It's a little intimidating. Some people really don't like it. We call it the big donut because it looks like, if you've never seen one, it looks like a very big square with a big circle in the middle that you lie in. And it makes lots of, kind of blips and blops, sounds a bit like minimal techno. But if you lie there, you're non-invasively able to acquire a huge amount of insight into what's going on in the brain, and also actually the spinal cord as well. So the trick is we have this powerful tool, and then what we want to do with that tool is then design experiments that specifically ask key questions about how the brain is becoming activated, as I said, by different types of pain, how it is extending into a tonic and ongoing state, and then how we can relieve that pain. Yeah.
So where is pain in the brain? What areas of the brain are involved?
That's a great question. So a lot of people might be surprised to know that pain actually doesn't come from one part of the brain. So there isn't just one pain center in the brain. But rather what you see when you put someone in pain into the scanner is that many parts of the brain become activated. We call them brain blobs. But basically the brain activates, becomes very lit up. Many parts of the brain are activated and engaged. And so the key of the research is trying to understand, so we've identified which regions are active, but now we want to understand how they're communicating with one another. What are the networks? How are the network activity? How is that important for different types of pain? And then also, as I said, looking at different ways of coping or alleviating the pain. What are those networks? What regions of the brain are necessary to help control the pain, to turn the pain down?
And does pain in different people look the same? So I mean, is there like a similar network? Do you see the same areas in different people lighting up when they're in pain?
So pain, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a complex experience, and I use the word multivariate. So pain it's subjective, and what I mean by that is that you have nociception, which is the kind of electrochemical, neurophysiological signaling that there is damaging physical input to your skin, and then that information is then brought to the cortex, and then on top of that you layer the person's cognitive state, their emotional state, aspects of maybe their memory about maybe, this is a traumatic experience that they've had before, or maybe it's a brand new experience that they've never had. Both of those things are really important in terms of framing what they experience. So all of these things go into which regions then become active and how activated they become. So a big part of the experimental side of pain neuroscience is trying to be very careful about how you're measuring this activity in relation to these different variables that we know vary across the population. So your emotional state, your cognitive state, these different things are things that we can actually measure in individuals, so we can help control and essentially be good scientists, if you will, about this activity change that we see.
So, for example, an emotional state like anxiety, which I'm sure, like, if you're coming to a dentist, you might already be anxious.
Yeah, exactly. So anxiety is a key player in terms of being able to turn the pain way up. So when people get very anxious, that can make them much more sensitive. And there's a great deal of research into that. You can also have the opposite happen, where people become very hypervigilant, they become defensive, and they're very good at mounting an almost defensive response. So they're in less, they report that they're in less pain. And there are good reasons for that. You can imagine like the flight or fight response. where if there's damage to your body, but it's a dangerous scenario, you need to be focusing on surviving, not on how much pain you feel. So these are things that are well known in the population, and also play a big role in terms of trying to understand why I might be much more sensitive in this dentist chair than maybe you are, for example. So.
I had a great dentist growing up. No pain calls there. So in your research then, you said, you want to look into people's heads, look at their brains when they're experiencing pain. So are you causing pain? How are you doing your research there?
Yeah, so we do definitely, we very safely are able to do certain types of pain experiences in the scanner. And I should say we're not, it's not evil, it sounds very scary, but a common one that I use is capsaicin cream. So capsaicin is the active ingredient in chili peppers. They make chili peppers taste spicy. They give it the heat. And I don't know if you've ever used something like Tiger Balm, it's really similar, that has capsaicin in it. But if you rub that on the skin, just in a cream form, it won't damage the skin, it's perfectly safe, you just can't get it in your eyes because then it will burn your eyes, which is terrible. But over a short period of time, what will happen is that you'll feel a tingling, you'll feel a warming sensation. That warming sensation will start to become a painful heating sensation. And that is related to the fact that the capsaicin is actually activating TRPV1 receptors, which are very important for mediating this heat response in your skin. So by using that very well-known, very safe type of reaction on the skin with a cream, we can then modulate the skin using temperature, heating and cooling, and you can make that experience much more painful or much less painful. So that's very then easy to adapt to an experimental setting where you're imaging the brain. Other things that people use are, you can use like a pinching. If you pinch your skin, that's painful. You can use pinpricks, which don't actually break the skin, but they can just, they put a pressure into the skin, which can become painful. People have also used things like hypertonic saline to almost like as if you'd gone on like a marathon run and your muscles are really achy. You can induce that kind of an experiment in a really safe way in the scanner. But the point of all of that is that I'm interested in looking at tonic and ongoing pain, so pain that lasts for many, many minutes, even hours, because that's analogous to what chronic pain patients are suffering from. So the point of this work is, as I said earlier, is looking at how a healthy brain is functioning in the context of that type of an experience. So then we can understand how, for example, chronic pain patients are similarly active, similar to healthy people, and how it's different, and how it can become dysfunctional.
All right, so you have healthy people in your MRI and you're inducing pain. Yeah. That's not harming them. But you're also getting brain imaging from chronic pain patients, so you're kind of comparing and...
Yeah.
Right. So what have you found so far? Are there any good candidates of things that you can investigate further?
Yes, that's a great question. So one of the things that we have found is that in chronic pain patients, in many types of chronic pain, they have altered brainstem functioning. And the brainstem is a really powerful, really core region of the brain that is able to turn the pain volume up or down. There's actually this, we call it the descending pain modulatory system. It's a very fancy turn of phrase to say that it's almost like an accelerator or a brake on the nociceptive content that's reaching the brain. And so what we find is that in many types of chronic pain, that system is altered. It becomes dysfunctional. And so that's very helpful and very powerful information to know because it gives us a whole set, it defines our regions of interest to a select core where we can start to think very carefully about, okay, if we know that this is dysfunctional chronic pain, can we use this as a measure to predict, for example, who might become a chronic pain patient later on? So you can imagine that that's a very powerful tool to offer to clinicians to decide if someone should have a type of surgery or not, for example. So if someone's very likely to have more of an amplification of pain if they were to have a surgery, maybe we should think differently about whether or not they should have that surgery, for an example. There are other kind of key, this is early days too, so it's exciting because imaging is actually, it's so powerful, but it's a field that moves very quickly too. So there's many other parts of the brain that are interest to other people, but for us, I'm really interested in this descending pain modulatory system.
Okay, so from now on, I guess you'll be investigating that in more and more detail. And is the hope that you'll identify, a drug, or what sort of treatment do you think could you target to that sort of area?
Yeah, so there is a lot of work into the pharmacology of these regions, and we know that the parts of the brain that are turning the pain up versus turning them down, they're very powerful neurochemical targeting that happens. So there's the circuitry there is complex and is a whole field of interest exactly for this purpose of designing better drugs that are able to target specific nodes in this circuitry. And so that work is being done, and it's very exciting to see what will happen in that space. I myself am not a pharmacologist, so my interest is more thinking about identifying the basic kind of core neurobiology and neurophysiology of these circuitry. But one thing I think that's really cool and exciting is how people can learn different types of cognitive methods of basically top-down modulation of these circuitry. So things like meditation, things like CBT, these are really powerful and really commonly used methods that people try to actually dampen down their pain and have some control over that. So that's a whole field of interest of mine moving forward.
So that's sort of the way people think and control breathing. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah. So there's a whole field of trying to understand things like interoception, so how our body environment is being altered, and how certain aspects that we can learn actually to control some of these things. And if you speak to people who are really into meditation or they've really benefited from certain types of CBT, they'll tell you that it really works for them. But it's about learning, how can we tailor those methods in a way that's specifically, benefiting this particular circuitry that we know to be involved. But also the thing that I'm really interested in is this predictive. So being able to identify circuitry that you could almost think about it as like at-risk circuitry. So individuals, they might be perfectly, normal, or they have a healthy functioning of the system. But you can imagine groups of people where maybe the system's just a little bit different. It doesn't mean that they're ill. It just means that they're more likely to develop a chronic pain state in the future. So if you can identify those individuals before they have chronic pain, you're really protecting people. You're really giving them, you're doing people a lot of good, I think. So that's a huge excitement for me.
And just in terms of thinking about at-risk people, like, do you have any sense or ideas of what leads to those differences? Is it genetic or environmental? Or
So there's many factors that go into it, and it's a very active field of research within the pain neuroscience community. So there's many risk factors that go into it, and you're right, you've identified a number of them. So there are genetic factors, emotional kind of state and trait factors that go into it, and then these kind of core neurobiology, neurophysiological targets as well. And within that, so it's an active body of research that's going on right now, and it's very exciting. But it's, again, multivariate and it's complex. There's a number of things that will likely to fit into it. So it's an exciting field. Definitely watch that space.
Yeah, and we've got a question here from someone watching. Thanks so much for sending that in. I guess we sort of covered it in terms of how pain works, but they've specifically asked, how does pain work in childbirth, and can we make it a less painful experience?
Oh, that's a great question. So, so there are really, so when I was mentioning the circuitry that we have built into us that allow us to turn pain off or down and turn it up, childbirth is amazing because when the child is being born, there is that circuitry is actually being hijacked in a way to make sure that baby gets born in a way that is possible. So it makes it manageable enough. But I'm sure that for many people, they would never want to have a child without necessarily using drugs, really powerful drugs that help mediate that. So it's obviously something that's very difficult to study properly because of the obvious complexity that the baby's, birthing the baby is the key important task there. But I agree that for some people, the drugs often don't work, or it's much more complex. And so, again, it's an example of where people need to have better ways of managing their pain. And it wouldn't necessarily just be painkillers, but also you can imagine there's some really good non-drug-based methods that could be very helpful as well. But I agree, it's an extremely important part of medicine that that deserves attention, and I hope some of the stuff that we're talking about today, even though it feels a little abstract and it's about more basic science, it could hopefully translate into that space and provide a lot of insight into improving care.
When you say modulate it, are you saying that the pain system is being purposefully dampened down or up?
Right. So that's a great question. So and sometimes the science lingo, I apologize. That's I don't mean to be obfuscating, but because pain is multivariate. You have each of these different variables that play into the overall experience. And so when I use that word modulate, what I mean is essentially change in a way that is predictable and also that you have control over. And so each of these different variables that go into it can be altered potentially. But if nociception, that electrochemical signal of damage that's coming into the brain, if that's constant, you can't change that necessarily, then what are the other variables that we can change that can then turn that down? So we can't change the content necessarily. Well, we could. You can block the periphery. But if you can't do that, what are the other ways that you can modulate, change the pain experience?
Right, so the brain tries to make childbirth a little bit more bearable in that case. Yeah.
And so I have my sister-in-law has done has had a non-medicalized birth. There are individuals, I know many people that have done it without necessarily using drugs. Those are individuals that are there's a whole process of how it's possible that they can do that. And other people, that's maybe not a good idea. That they, for whatever reason, going a more kind of standard and traditional approach is a better thing for them. But again, I don't know much about childbirth, but I agree that it's super interesting. And I hope that this basic science work can help inform that kind of care in the future.
Yeah. So you mentioned the nociceptive or the nerve fibers that are in our skin that help us detect pain, where they send the signals of the experience that we then experience as pain.
Yes.
But someone watching has asked, is the brain the only part of the body that has no sensation? So are our brains numb? What is a headache?
Right. So we actually do have. So the nociceptors are letting us actually sense the environment, and then that information is coming into the brain. And there are good reasons for. So the headache, for example, is a different. It's nociceptors that are in the trigeminal system. So the trigeminal system is essentially the nerves that are innervating our face and also our head as well. So headache and migraine are a huge part of the pain neuroscience community, trying to understand what those mechanisms are and how migraine specifically is different from headache, etc. So migraine specifically is of huge interest to me, and there's some really exciting work being done specifically about these brainstem circuitry that I mentioned, this descending pain control system, in which it's very likely impossible that for many types of chronic migraineurs, for example, episodic migraineurs, that there are these triggers that are happening in which the system is being thrown into a pain state. And so understanding that and how that's happening is a huge interest, and there's a lot of really exciting work being done in that space. But it's new, actually. It's a new field, but very, very important. So yeah. I've got some sunlight in my head.
So it's true then that the brain itself isn't experiencing the pain. It's to do with everything else around the head.
It's taking this information in, and then what the brain is doing is it's essentially coordinating or processing all this information. And so how the brain does that, we don't know. So we don't yet know how the information is being ordered together and being woven together into a conscious subjective experience. But anyone who is interested in, for example, consciousness neuroscience, these are really hot, key, core, and super interesting questions that we hope to be able to understand in the future. But brain imaging is a key tool to letting us be able to do that.
So probably have all experienced time when different people have different thresholds for pain and things like that. Is that an entirely cognitive thing? So the way people think?
Yeah. So this is another really interesting thing, that you have this heterogeneity in the population. So many people, and they feel pain differently, and that can come down to, again, each of these variables that we mentioned before. They can each have variability in the population. So some people actually will feel pain differently because they literally don't even have nociceptors. So some people don't actually even experience pain because they don't express fully functional nociceptors themselves. So it's an extreme example, but I offer it as an example of how each of these different components that we know goes into building the experience of pain become important.
Cool. And I guess we couldn't really be talking about pain without mentioning the placebo effect, which I'm sure many people are aware of. But could you say something about that and pain?
Sure. So the placebo effect is so interesting, and it's an example of we use the word endogenous, but what I mean by that word is an inbuilt, we're born with it, system. Which again is related to this descending pain modulatory system in the brainstem, in which we're able to turn the pain down. And the trigger for that is often by way of say a sugar pill, or maybe it's a big injection of something that is actually not an active compound. So the chemical or the drug that you think that you're having, that's just a switch, if you will, to then driving this top-down modulation of the pain. And so a tremendous amount of work has gone into really understanding the core physiology and biology of this very real, very powerful mechanism that we're built with to be able to manage and control pain. And the flip of that is nocebo. So when you actually, you expect the opposite, really, where it actually can become much more painful, or you don't experience placebo at all. And that can become a problem for pain, is what I mean to say. And so when people, if you think about it, if they're continuously going in to the clinic, hoping that this treatment's going to work, at a certain point, their expectation has not been met. So it's almost like a failed expectation scenario. And that becomes very problematic, thinking about the future and whether they can ever experience relief. And so that research, understanding both placebo and then the flip, the nocebo effect, is really, really important to being able to, again, think of much better types of pain therapies in the future, especially for these individuals that have had pain for their whole lives. The treatments that are currently offered don't work for them. So how do we help those individuals is a key interest within that community.
Yeah, so that is quite incredible that you just expect something to work or not work, and it can when it comes to
it. engages this very powerful, very real neurochemical process in our brains.
Yeah, and I've heard pink pills in particular are the most effective.
Yeah, there's exactly, and this is you're inducing this expectation effect, right? So, and it can work in the opposite way too. If I expect that it might be really terrible, as we were mentioning before, sometimes it makes the experience much worse. But yes, to engage a good, strong placebo effect, it's the white gloves, it's the lab coat, the bright pill. All these things are important for engaging that expectation that it's gonna work. But doing rigorous science, doing proper placebo-controlled work with looking at novel compounds. I mean, this is really important for being able to say, that this new compound is actually doing something that's better than we already know can happen from placebo, for example. So.
Yeah, super important to science. Well, we've been talking for quite a while now, so I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you to everyone who's been watching.
Yeah.
Continue to leave your comments and questions in the comments box. I'm sure we can get back to them.
Yeah, of course. I would be happy to engage more with the comment stream for sure.
Perfect. So thanks again. Remember to join us tomorrow when we'll be at an MRI machine to do a live brain imaging experiment. And that's it from us. Thank you to 42 St Giles Dental Surgery, and we'll see you next time.
Cool. Thank you.